lying for money. How Legendary Frauds Reveal the Workings of the World by Dan Davies, summarized by Detailed Book Summaries. Don't forget to subscribe. Let us know in the comment below the book you would love us to summarize for you. Chapter 1. The Ancient Art of Deception. Fraud, as Dan Davies opens his book, is not a modern creation. It is as old as civilization itself, woven into the fabric of trade, politics, and human psychology. The moment people began to exchange goods based on promises and trust, the possibility of deceit was born. Davies begins his exploration by showing that fraud is not simply the act of lying for gain. It's an exploitation of trust, the invisible glue that holds every economy together. Without trust, no one would lend, invest, or trade. Yet with trust, the door to deception opens wide. This paradox, trust enabling deceit, is the heartbeat of Davies' analysis. He takes readers back to the earliest marketplaces, where merchants and traders would weigh their goods on scales that could easily be tampered with. A dishonest trader could add hidden weights or hollow out the measuring stones, cheating buyers who relied on the illusion of fairness. From there, Davies draws a clear line to modern financial systems, arguing that the mechanisms of deceit haven't changed, only the tools have evolved. Whether through forged coins or falsified ledgers, fraud has always depended on human belief. The con artist doesn't merely steal money, he manufactures confidence. Davies also delves into the psychology of deception, describing how the best fraudsters are not necessarily the most intelligent, but the most persuasive. They have an intuitive understanding of human emotion, greed, fear, pride, and hope, and they manipulate those feelings with precision. He references the concept of the confidence trick, showing that every fraud begins not with a crime, but with a story. The victim is seduced into believing something that aligns with their desires. A profitable investment, a rare opportunity, a trustworthy friend. By the time the lie is exposed, it's often too late. What makes this chapter powerful is Davies' ability to portray fraud as both ancient and eternal. From early maritime insurance scams to counterfeit currency schemes, he demonstrates that fraudsters have always been innovators, using the technology and institutions of their time to invent new forms of deceit. Yet his tone is not cynical. Instead, he suggests that studying fraud helps us understand something fundamental about ourselves, our yearning to believe, even when we shouldn't. Fraud, in a sense, is humanity's shadow. It exists because trust exists, and the two cannot be separated. By the end of this chapter, readers begin to see fraud not as isolated criminality, but as a mirror reflecting the human condition. Every con artist, from ancient traders to modern financiers, is playing on the same stage, the stage of belief. The world works because we trust it to, and fraud reveals the fragility of that faith. Chapter 2. The Anatomy of a Con. In the second chapter, Davies dissects fraud as though it were a living organism, complex, adaptive, and sustained by the vulnerabilities of its victims. He introduces the three essential pillars that make any fraud work: trust, plausibility, and opportunity. Without trust, the lie cannot take root. Without plausibility, it cannot survive. Without opportunity, it cannot spread. Every successful con artist, from the local swindler to the global financial manipulator, constructs their scheme by exploiting all three. Davies brings this to life with vivid examples. One of the most famous is Charles Ponzi, the man who gave his name to the most enduring scam in financial history. Ponzi promised investors astronomical returns through a clever-sounding arbitrage involving international postal coupons. The brilliance of the scheme lay in its plausibility. Postal coupons were real, and so were currency fluctuations. What investors didn't realize was that Ponzi wasn't actually engaging in the trade he described. Instead, he was paying early investors with the money of later ones, creating a cycle of illusion that looked like profit. When the scheme finally collapsed, it left behind thousands of ruined investors and a timeless lesson about the danger of unchecked belief. Davies uses Ponzi's story to illustrate that the most effective frauds are not wild fantasies, but convincing distortions of the truth. Fraudsters succeed because they mimic legitimate systems so perfectly that even experts struggle to tell the difference. In modern finance, this often takes the form of falsified accounts or fake investment vehicles that imitate real products. The fraudster's art is imitation. They dress lies in the clothing of truth. The chapter also explores the psychology of complicity. Many victims of fraud, Davies argues, are not entirely innocent. Their greed or overconfidence makes them active participants in their own deception. They want to believe the story so badly that they overlook warning signs. This is why, he notes, frauds thrive in good times, when optimism blinds people to risk. During booms, skepticism fades, and belief becomes contagious. Davies closes the chapter by explaining that every fraud follows a similar life cycle. It begins small, fueled by ambition or desperation. It grows through validation and imitation, and it ends in collapse when the lie becomes too heavy to sustain. Like a bubble, a fraud can expand indefinitely until it bursts. What remains afterward is not just financial loss, but disillusionment. As victims realize, they weren't merely tricked by a person, they were tricked by a system of belief that seemed unshakable. Chapter 3: The Golden Age of Corporate Deceit. If earlier frauds were the work of individual tricksters, the 20th century ushered in a new era, corporate fraud, on an industrial scale. In this chapter, Davies explores how organizations, not just individuals, began to lie for money. From Enron to WorldCom, from Barings Bank to Lehman Brothers, he shows that fraud evolved from street-level scams to boardroom conspiracies. Davies paints Enron as the archetype of modern corporate deceit. Once hailed as an innovative energy company, Enron built a labyrinth of shell entities and off-the-books transactions to hide its losses and inflate profits. Executives spoke in the language of innovation, promising to revolutionize the energy market, while in reality, they were engineering illusions. Investors, seduced by the company's reputation and complex jargon, poured billions into a fantasy. When the truth emerged, the company's empire of lies collapsed overnight, taking thousands of jobs and billions of dollars with it. The author argues that these corporate frauds are not just the work of a few bad apples. Instead, they arise from cultural and structural pressures, the relentless demand for growth, the fear of failure, and the reward systems that prize short-term results over long-term integrity. Fraud becomes not an act of rebellion against the system, but a product of it. The line between legitimate risk-taking and deception becomes dangerously thin. Davies also notes that regulators, auditors, and investors often become unwitting enablers of fraud. Their oversight systems rely on trust in numbers, trust in management, trust in reputation. Once that trust is misplaced, it creates the perfect environment for deceit to thrive. Fraudsters exploit this blind faith, presenting complex financial instruments and artificial profits that no one dares to question. Through these examples, Davies demonstrates that the modern corporation itself can become a fraud machine, where collective rationalization replaces individual morality. People convince themselves that bending the truth is just a temporary measure until the lie becomes the company's foundation. This is why, he writes, large frauds are rarely stopped early. Everyone involved is too invested in believing the story. The golden age of corporate fraud is therefore not just about money, it's about culture. It reveals how ambition, pressure, and belief can warp institutions built to create value into instruments of deception. Chapter 4: The Invisible Web of Modern Fraud. In the 4th chapter, Davies turns to the 21st century, where technology and globalization have transformed both commerce and crime. The digital revolution has made financial systems faster, more complex, and more interconnected, but also more vulnerable. In this new landscape, fraud has become invisible, operating through lines of code, data manipulation, and anonymous transactions. Davies examines the 2008 global financial crisis as a collective act of self-deception. Here, there was no single con artist. Instead, entire industries believed their own lies. Banks sold mortgage-backed securities that were filled with toxic loans. Rating agencies stamped them safe, and investors bought them with blind faith. Everyone wanted to believe that the system was stable because belief itself was profitable. When reality surfaced, it wasn't just a financial collapse, it was a collapse of trust. He also explores digital fraud from online Ponzi schemes to cryptocurrency scams. The internet, Davies notes, has democratized deception. Anyone with a laptop can now impersonate a business, forge identities, or launch a fake investment platform. Anonymity, automation, and globalization make these crimes harder to trace and easier to scale. Yet, paradoxically, technology also offers solutions. Tools like blockchain and AI-driven fraud detection are creating new ways to rebuild trust. Davies argues that the digital age has redefined what it means to lie for money. Fraud today is not just about falsifying numbers, it's about manipulating information itself. Truth has become fluid, fragmented across algorithms and screens. This, he warns, makes modern society more susceptible than ever to deception. Through sharp analysis and real-world cases, Davies portrays a world where trust is both our greatest strength and our greatest weakness. In this invisible web of transactions, the difference between honesty and fraud is often a matter of perception. Chapter 5: Lessons from the Lies We Believe. In his closing chapter, Davies steps back from the case studies to reflect on the deeper meaning of fraud. He concludes that fraud is not an accident of capitalism. It is a fundamental feature of any trust-based system. Wherever faith exists, deceit follows. The goal, therefore, is not to eliminate fraud completely, an impossible task, but to understand it deeply enough to manage its impact. He stresses that prevention begins with balance, a balance between skepticism and trust. Too little trust, and the economy stalls. Too much, and fraud flourishes. Healthy systems, Davies suggests, depend on transparency, accountability, and the courage to question success. Many of the world's biggest frauds persisted because no one wanted to challenge a good story. When profits are high and reputations glitter, skepticism feels like heresy. Davies closes by noting that fraudsters, in a perverse way, are teachers. They reveal the weaknesses in our systems, our institutions, and ourselves. Each great con exposes the human tendency to prefer comforting illusions over inconvenient truths. In their wake, societies often grow stronger, learning to design better safeguards. The history of fraud, then, is also a history of progress, a reminder that every deception forces us to refine how we define and defend truth. Ultimately, Lying for Money is not a book about crime. It's a study of civilization. Through wit, insight, and rich storytelling, Dan Davies shows that the same trust that allows us to build markets, nations, and dreams is also what allows us to be deceived. Fraud is the shadow of belief, and to understand it is to understand the fragile machinery of the modern world. Thanks for watching. Let us know in the comment below the book you would love us to summarize for you.